deserves to be. That is the tragedy of journalism itself, because journalism is also everything of the moment. If it ceases to be of the moment, it becomes history, not journalism. But having said that, it is really a paradox. The life of Vakkom Moulavi becomes significant even more so today because we are back in a time cycle where the role of the owner-publisher becomes important, far more important than the role of the editor. There was a phase in the evolution of journalism in the 80s, well up until the 80s and 90s, when the editor was seen as representing the quintessential freedoms that journalism guaranteed. The editorial integrity, editorial stance, editorial ideology, these were all important facets of journalism. There was a sacred wall in newspaper organizations between what is called the editorial and the marketing. And a marketing person did not dare tell the editorial what should or should not be done. Marketing was broadly seen as synonymous with ownership because that's where the money was generated. Why I say this is significant is because today, in India at least, and it is true of across the world as well, there is hardly an editor of that stature anymore. Think about it. Look at the newspapers we have, look at the editorial the channels that we have, television news channels that we have. There is not one editor of eminence who we can say is definitive, is indispensable to the running of that organization. On the other hand, the owner, the publisher, has become of supreme importance. This sidelining of the editor, this marginalization of the editor in journalism is unfortunate because along with it, journalism has lost a large part of its soul. And that is compounded by the fact that the owner publishers who run newspaper organizations today are hardly committed to the values, to the cardinal values, to the core principles of journalism, as much as they are committed or interested in the revenues, in the returns, in the profit margins, in the balance sheet that the organization can show. And therefore, when you have a persona like Vakkom Moulavi, who was not just an owner, he was an editor in his own right, he would write, as was explained here, who was a visionary, who as far back as 1905 sets up Swadesh Abhiman, who first subscribes to Reuters channel. That required a huge quantum leap of imagination. I was reading today, in addition to the information that we have, Sabin Iqbal's article which appeared on Manorama Online about Vakkom Moulavi, which is a very interesting piece. I recommend that you should all read it, which gives you a sense of the passion of the man, the commitment of the man to what he was doing. And therefore, the first point I want to make is that we need, in an age when owners and publishers have indeed eclipsed editors, owners and publishers of the caliber of Vakkom Moulavi, then journalism has a future. Then journalism has a bright future. Journalism has a future as a business. That's another matter. Journalism as a profession, as something which is transformative, that makes a difference to the lives of the people of this country as a future. The theme of my speech today is supposed to be ethics of, or challenges of ethical journalism in contemporary context today. Ethics is a problematic word in many ways. It's also an enduring word in many ways. And when it comes to ethics of journalism, I would first like to try and define it so that we understand what we are talking about. ethics of journalism cannot vary from place to place. You cannot have one ethics for journalism in India, another ethics of journalism in the United States, and a third ethics of journalism, let's say, somewhere in the Gulf countries. Even the law of the land can differ from country to country, from nation to nation. When we say we need rule of law, which is seen as a characteristic of democracy, as a defining feature of democracy, it's not saying too much, because rule of law can vary from place to place. In some countries, if there is an ounce of drug found on you, capital punishment is rule of law. In some countries, if you're a thief, perhaps cutting your hand is rule of law. In some countries, there is no capital punishment at all. That may be rule of law. In some countries, you may have rule of law and yet have rules of laws beyond and above that, which are in actual practice, like the Katta Panchayats or Thap Panchayats we have in India. It doesn't matter what the rule of law is. In distant villages in this country, there are their own private panchayats which deliver the law, which take the law and deliver the law and enforce the law. So there cannot be cultural relativism of that kind when it comes to journalism, the ethics of journalism. Because if you concede differences and degrees of ethics in journalism, then journalism is a lost cause. Journalism is an essential extension of democracy. If you are able to say democracy in one breath, you must be able to say a free media, a free press in the next breath. Otherwise, that democracy is really a sham. We have qualified democracies in this world. We have, let us say, military democracies in some cases. We have judicially enforced democracies. Now, those are not true democracies because there is no free press in those contexts. Take even the example of, say, our South Asian neighbors like Singapore, for instance. There is a thriving press there, but not politically as free as one would like it to be. Economically, yes, free. The financial press is very vibrant, is very free. In some of the other South Asian countries too, the press is not as free as we in India are. Interestingly, in Pakistan, the press is very free. Although you are supposed to have a military-run government or a government which is not truly representative, the democracy in Pakistan has been challenged. It's called guided democracy, a benign democracy, and so on. But the press has always been very vibrant. You find very, very adversarial press there in Pakistan. So you find various kinds of democracies operating, and the degree of the success of the democracy depends on the degree of the freedom of the press in that particular context. And therefore, when I use the term ethics of journalism, I'm talking about a universal, a consensual concept of the ethics of journalism. And the first duty of a free press is to decide who the press is for. What is the journalism for? Who is the journalist for? What is it that drives your passion? Karl Marx famously said that the first freedom of the press, or rather, the first freedom of the free press is not to be a business. Not to be a business. That, of course, is a different socialist vision of journalism. Unfortunately, that was not elaborated on, that could not be implemented, that could not be tried or experimented with, because the history of socialism with journalism is very pathetic. They did not encourage journalism. Even after the Russian Revolution, you know that journalists were frowned upon because there was a context of wartime communism, and they thought that someone critical of the system at this stage, when the system is vulnerable, will do damage to the system, and therefore journalists were not encouraged, and that became a habit, an unfortunate habit, and that habit led right up to the collapse of the entire socialist bloc. When I was a journalist, a practicing journalist, one of the interesting assignments I had was to go to Berlin, just before the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and shortly afterwards, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But even in the months prior to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, any perceptive journalist could see that the wall was bound to collapse, because the people were already changing. The worm, as the saying goes, was already turning. The people were already receiving ideas of the free world, what they call the free world. There was a famous serial in those days called Dallas. It was an American serial which celebrated consumerism, conspicuous consumption, rich people in big mansions, swimming pools, extraordinary, extravagant lifestyles. That's the theme of these serials. And there was a German version of this which was meant for West Germany, not East Germany. But people in East Germany would receive this, because by then direct broadcast satellite technology had come about. And therefore anyone could put a dish outside his yard or on his building and receive signals. And the Erich Honecker government was already on its last legs. It didn't have the will to crack down on this. And so I found that home after home people were watching Dallas in German. And they believed, because they were brought up under a protected system, there was no freedom of information, they really believed that this is how the rest of the world lives. And they said, this government, this socialist government of ours, has been depriving us those lovely swimming pools, those huge cars, those huge mansions, those refrigerators, those lovely schools, those parks, those holidays on the beach. So because they said this is how capitalism survives and lives and thrives. And therefore the revolution of rising expectations begins, which I think played a very big part in the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So this is what happens when you protect information. Information cannot be protected or contained. That's the first lesson that we know as journalists. And therefore the ethic of journalism is, the first ethic of journalism is, whether you're a business or not, you don't have to be Maxine and say the first freedom of the press is not to be a business, but even as a business, it has to have a social purpose. It has to have a public purpose. The public interest is crucial to journalism, is the essence of journalism, is what dynamizes journalism and makes it a purposive activity. If there is no public purpose, it is a private business. If it is a private business, it does not deserve any of the protections that our constitution gives it. In India, journalism derives its rights through Article 19(1) A and G of the Constitution, which speak about, it's a fundamental rights chapter in the Constitution, which speaks about freedom of the press. It doesn't speak about freedom of the press. The word press doesn't come there at all. It speaks about freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom to practice any profession. These are the three clauses under which you derive the freedom of the press. There is no stipulated freedom of the press in the Indian Constitution. Unlike the US Constitution, where it is a stipulated right. The First Amendment to the US Constitution indeed states, Congress shall make no laws which abridge the freedom of the press. It's categoric, it's prescribed. Not in the Indian Constitution. It only speaks about these three areas: freedom of expression, freedom of movement, freedom to practice any profession. And freedom of expression is also qualified by what are called reasonable restrictions. So any Indian citizen can choose to be a journalist, can choose to start a journalistic media organization in print, television, online, provided there are reasonable restrictions. But why would the Constitution, it is through successive verdicts in court, shall we say judicial construct, that journalism has begun to enjoy this constitutional and moral high ground that it does today. It is not a stipulated constitutional right. And why do the people of this country, why do the courts of this country give journalism such a moral high ground, such a constitutional, at least interpreted high ground? Because the implicit faith, the belief is that journalism is an essential part of democracy. As I said, if you say democracy in one breath, you must say journalism, a free media in the next breath. But when journalism is not that, therefore the essential ethic of journalism is to keep that public interest in mind, constant focus in mind. And journalism which departs from the public interest has no business to enjoy any of these privileges. It can be like any other business in the market. You are selling soap in the market, you can sell journalism in the market. Unfortunately, you don't even have the protections of a consumerist court in terms of journalism. If I buy bad soap in the market, and instead of cleaning my skin, it scratches my skin, I can go to a consumer's court. I have not heard of anyone going to a consumer's court and saying, I've been reading this trash for the last 7 years and it's polluted my mind and my entire family. I want damages of $5 million or 5 million rupees. Because we have conceded that journalism is a democratic agency. But in actual fact, when it is not, it is being grossly unethical. It is betraying our trust. It is betraying the constitutional construct. It is betraying the judicial interpretations that have been given to this noble calling, which is supposed to make a difference to our lives, which is supposed to be transformative. Therefore, the public interest in journalism is what energizes journalism, is what defines journalism. It's a sine qua non of journalism. It's a defining characteristic of journalism. So that is the first major point that I want to make. And unfortunately, we have today, and I don't think I'm inventing anything or discovering anything when I say this. I don't think anybody can put our hands to our hearts today and say that the journalism we read or see or hear today keeps the public interest in constant focus. The public interest happens to be coming along with private interest, which is profit-making. Profit-making is not a bad word. I mean, I can be an extreme socialist and say, like Karl Marx, that the first business of the free press is not to be a business. But you don't have to be, because the history of the press is really one of capitalism. The free press began in the capitalist world. As a result of the introduction of capitalism, in the 17th century, the recognition of what is called the public sphere, which Habermas later defined as a public sphere, was as a result of capitalism. That is how booksellers, book publishing came into vogue. Then there was a religious impetus, there was a technological impetus because of printing. The Gutenberg revolution was over in the 15th century. Caxton Press had come, printing was taking place. So there was a financial impetus, which is capitalism, technological impetus, and there was a religious impetus because there was a Reformation movement in England. And in the Reformation, a lot of Bibles had to be published. And there was a huge splurge, a kind of exponential growth of publishing in the early 16th century, around 1517 or so. And towards the end of the 16th century, there was a counter-reformation where the Catholic publications sought to counter the Protestant, publications. So there was another upsurge in publishing. So it is the publisher who was becoming important, and journalism was only happening as a corollary, as something that was also ran along with this whole process. So it was a huge capitalist growth, and you will find that the first big journalists were actually the people who had control of the means of production and distribution. Because of the growth of the penny press, what's called the wide distribution of the press, because the state was subsidizing it by allowing it to be distributed almost free of cost. In England and later in America, that is why it's no coincidence that the first big newspaper journalists, first big publishers in the United States were postmaster generals, whether it's Benjamin Franklin or Madison, they were all postmaster generals, and they became the first big publishers of newspapers because they were sitting on the post office, which is a distribution mechanism. Distribution is so important to this whole trade. So you find that the capitalist growth of journalism is certainly a narrative which is very important. And therefore, to come back to my point, it's not that making money or making profit is a bad idea. You need, in fact, to have profits to be bold as a journalist. If your newspaper or your channel is not making money, you are that much more vulnerable to pressures from those who want to pressurize you. Because they can tempt you with money, they can tempt you with advertising, they can tempt you with loans, which you need. So you need a healthy bottom line in terms of your balance sheet. But there's a difference between making a profit and profiteering. And the big growth in the media over the last 20 or 30 years has been in terms of profiteering. Ever since globalization and liberalization, literally speaking, in the 1991-92 period, you will find a big shift in the way journalism has proceeded, and that trajectory, or that path, has been one of maximizing profits and minimizing public interest. Maximizing profits and minimizing public interest. And therefore, you have phenomena like paid news. You have situations where you don't know what is news and what is advertisement. You know the famous story of it's a scandal, paid news scandal, where you allow advertising or promotional packages or propaganda to pass as news without defining it as advertisement or paid for promotional packages. Whether it's for candidates for an election or for ideas or for business interests. And the Press Council has a huge report on paid news which is rusting somewhere in the shelves of the Press Council. So you have distortions like this creeping in once the market paradigm took over journalism. It's one thing for journalism as a business to be on a sound footing. It's another to fall into the arms of the market. And that, I think, that shift that took place in the 20th, 21st century, in the 21st century really, around 2000, in the beginning of the dawn of the 21st century, was the beginning of the end of journalism as we understand it as an extension of democracy. And therefore, keeping the public interest in mind is very crucial. But here again, one needs to make a distinction. The public interest is not necessarily what the public wants. There's a big difference between the public interest and what the public wants. Many of the newspaper owners, barons, justify what they are doing in journalism, saying, but this is what the people want. People want gossip, people want voyeurism, people want sex and violence, people want, gossip, all kinds of news stories. That's what they want to hear. They want to see through the bedrooms of other people, keyhole journalism, voyeurism in the name of journalism. This is what people want. This is titillating. And therefore this process of tabloidization, of dumbing down, has become very popular, has become very important in journalism, almost indispensable for marketing. All in the name of this is what the people want. But what the people want and what you might give the people is not what is public interest journalism. Giving the people what they want is also the drug peddler's argument. I'm giving the people because people want Maykumari. That is no argument. People may want certain things. If you implement prohibition in a state, it is not because people want it or don't want it, may or may not want it, but because you believe it is the right thing to do for the health of the people, for the physical health of the people, if you do it. And therefore, responsible journalism, you don't need a brand of people, professionals called journalists, if all you have to do is give the people what they want. That anybody can do. Anybody who can write, read, speak can do that. You are there precisely because you act as a filter in terms of the public interest. Public interest would mean that which is important for the public, that which is the consensual opinion of journalism is important for the public. And therefore there's some cardinal rules in terms of the ethics of journalism. One of the cardinal rules is that you have a critical adversarial function. Critical adversarial function. There is no journalism worth its salt which is not critical, which is not adversarial. Adversarial not to the people, but to the state, to the big business lobbies, to those you think are making the lives of people miserable, to those you think are exploiting the people, to those you think are corrupt, to those you think are taking shortcuts in terms of bribery and other forms in order to cheat the system. It is the invigilation of journalism. It's a duty of journalism to be the invigilator, to keep a vigil. The vigil of democracy is journalism. And that function, unfortunately, you do get occasions of corruption scandals here and there. I mean, that is journalism. But on the other hand, you also find that journalism is increasingly becoming a vehicle for plans by government agencies, by big business, by big barons. Because the nature of journalism is that, because it's owned by the big business today. And therefore its own class interests, its own economic interests come into play in a very big way. And this has become particularly acute, and I'm making no bones of it, in the current government, where there's a systematic methodology of targeting the free press, being very upset when the press takes on the government, prescribing what the press should say, inducing false notions of what is a true citizen, prescribing nationalism, the kind of hysteria that goes in the name of prescribing nationalism in the media, which the media happily kind of, shall we say, takes on as a messenger, is ridiculous. If you are sure about your nationalism, if I am sure about my nationalism, I don't need to shout about it from the rooftops. It's only those who are not sure about nationalism who need to talk about it again and again and again. Nationalism is something which comes with you, it is instilled in you, it's part of you. Secularism, similarly, is something which is with you. You don't need to shout from rooftops every morning saying, good morning, today I'm a nationalist. Good morning, today also I'm a nationalist. A country which comes to that is in a tragic plight. And they're not doing this because they suspect there are, everybody is not, they're doing this because they are trying to create a particular ideology for the media, an ideological package for the media. And the media, unfortunately, is buying into it, and therefore abandoning its ethical, critical, adversarial function. You'll find channel after channel, particularly the English channel from prime time, they're spewing some brand of nationalism. They're telling everyone how we should behave, how we should, probably they'll soon tell us how we should dress, how we should eat, how we should look, how we should greet each other. This is no sign of democracy. This is increasingly a fascistic kind of, a trend that unfortunately the media is picking up. I can understand political parties being this or that. That's their business, and it's the business of others who don't believe it to counter that or oppose that. That is part of democracy. But it certainly is a problem when the hegemonic political forces or the ruling party uses its clout, uses its position to penetrate journalism and sabotage it and turns it around and makes it look ridiculous in the process. And therefore there's a huge credibility crisis today in journalism. In the this is there across the board, but more so in India, over the recent period. And this is because journalism is abandoning its critical adversarial role. Many of us, I know, in good times, have criticized newspapers and channels for being too critical. Today, when we look back, we'll realize the danger of that. When we say, why don't they let the government do its job? Why are they always critical of the government? Doesn't journalism have a positive role, a role to help development, developmental journalism? I personally think these are all dangerous concepts. Developmental journalism is not meant for journalists, that's meant for the PRO officers of the government department or those who are working there. They should put out handouts and have them circulated. It's not the business of journalism to celebrate as much as to criticize. Which doesn't mean it doesn't celebrate. If something grand is happening, something wonderful is happening by the establishment, that can be certainly considered, that can be lauded. But the greater role of democracy, of a free democratic press, of a free press, is to be critical, to watch out for scandals, to watch out for erosion of democracy, and that is why it is very important. And therefore, in terms of the ethics of journalism that we are going through today, we are in very, very, shall we say, dangerous times. And nobody can help journalists except themselves. And they have a duty to help themselves because all along, for all these decades, when journalists were in trouble, society, civil society, the people of this country stood by them. When emergency was declared in 1975 with Indira Gandhi, it was a costly mistake for Mrs. Gandhi because she thought she could ride roughshod over the press. But the people of this country did not suffer it. The people of this country stood shoulder to shoulder with the journalists, with the newspaper organizations, and they overcame that period. But that remains a black stain on our democratic record. It's not that governments have not tried subsequently to interfere with the press. Time and again, legislatures, both at the state level and the central level, have sought to bring draconian laws against the press, but they have not passed scrutiny. They have not become law because there was a sense that the people of the country will be against such a law which affects journalism. But today, journalism is a double bind. You have on the one hand forfeited your critical adversarial responsibility of being a watchdog of democracy, and on the other hand, you have lost the trust of your people, of your readership, of your viewers. In the United States recently, they did a survey to look at which profession enjoys the trust of the people the most and the least. And journalism featured in the bottom of the list, only slightly above the second-hand car salesman. You know, the second-hand car salesman will say all kinds of lies to sell his car. He'll say, it runs at so many miles, this is it, petrol. And journalism, the media, ranked just one step above that. I wouldn't be surprised if we held a poll in India today, our journalism will suffer the same fate. Because you can see the increasing skepticism of the ordinary reader, ordinary viewer about journalism. There is a huge credibility gap, there is a huge trust deficit, and therefore journalism is caught in a double bind between being pressured by the establishment, political establishment on the one hand, and the big businesses on the other hand, and losing the trust of the people on the other. And the political establishment and the big businesses are not necessarily two separate entities. They are co-joined. As you know, that's what we call this whole corporate liaison that goes on between politicians and the big business. It will be interesting to look at the ownership pattern of the media in India today, because we really don't have a transparent mapping of the media. You'll be surprised to know when such a report comes out that some of the very big businesses own more than 70 to 80% of the Indian media, of the big Indian media, either directly or at several removes, through Benami transactions or through front organizations. So there's a huge kind of collusion that is going on there. And the trust of the people is very, very crucial. So if we have seen in cases where elections, where channels have predicted that a party will win in Bihar, for instance, and the opposite party wins. So if channels had such huge impact, if they even read the people's opinions correctly, this would not happen. So there's a huge gap that's developing between the readership, the constituency, the civil society, and this profession of journalism. And this is, I think, having a huge impact in terms of the future of journalism and where it will go. The famous Italian professor Umberto Eco, who passed away recently, said that this is one of the paradoxes of journalism, that in a democracy you have what's called separation of powers. You have the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, and then the fourth pillar of democracy. You have the four pillars of democracy: executive, legislature, judiciary, and fourth estate, or the fourth pillar of democracy. And he said, while the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary are accountable to the people, because the president is only appointed by the parliament, by the party in power. The legislature, the parliament, has to go back to the people every 5 years to win back their vote. Even the judiciary is accountable to the people, because notionally you can impeach a judge with 2/3 majority in both houses of parliament. We have not done it yet, although a couple of judges came close to being impeached, but we didn't quite do it because we didn't want to drag the fair name of judiciary into the mud. It is only the fourth estate, or the fourth pillar of democracy, which is not so accountable in the sense of being institutionally or constitutionally accountable to the people. And he further says, indeed, that is the way it should be, because if the fourth estate, or the fourth pillar of democracy, is to be made accountable to the people, one of the other three pillars has to supervise that, right? Has to implement that. In such a case, it won't be a free press anymore. So that's a paradox. And therefore, the fourth estate, or the fourth pillar of democracy, has to be accountable to the people on its own volition, on its own accord. It has to put itself in the dock every once in a while and ask whether it is doing justly by the people. That is the only way it can be accountable, publicly accountable. That's the only way it can move towards a publicly accountable journalism, or journalism in the public interest. Unfortunately, journalism does not move in that direction at all. I think, therefore, it is digging its grave every way every which way you look at it, because if it's looking at itself purely as a business, as I said, it must then subscribe only to the laws of the market, not to the laws of civil society, not to the moral or constitutional high ground that we, the people of India, have given it. And these are therefore some of the big issues that face journalism today. I think in future there has to be a movement that will call journalism to account. I have worked in Doordarshan, so I know the compulsions of a government media. When I was in Doordarshan, all we were doing was saying wonderful things that the government did. You couldn't say anything very critical about that. I have no problem in confessing that, because there was no other television channel there. And it must be partly a rebelliousness against that that led me to start a channel which can say whatever it wanted. But today, when I look back, I think the Doordarshan brand of journalism is far, far better, far, far safer, far less dangerous to democracy than the current brand of journalism, where in the name of being private, in the name of being independent, in the name of being autonomous, you are actually carrying out the agenda of vested interests, political interests, commercial interests, who are planting stories day in and day out, and you are willfully carrying them forward. How is it that channel after channel after channel on prime time will have the same theme one day? Who decides this? How will they all get the same headlines at the same time? They'll discuss that in the same order. They'll have this, in fact, they'll also have the same guests appearing on the channel simultaneously sometimes. And it says live, so you don't even know how two people can appear in the same place. Or the same person can appear on 3 channels at the same time. Because there is a collusion, it's a process of a collusion. And this whole process is really affecting the ethics of journalism. Today, the danger of leaving out news that the competition may pick up determines your news. And therefore all of you carry the same news. If an editor in a newspaper says, we have missed a story, let's say Madhumi editor or any other newspaper editor says, we have missed a story, what does he or she mean? He doesn't mean that there are so many stories out there which we missed, because there are 100 million stories happening in the world every day. All that he means when he says we missed a story is that we did not carry a story which another channel or another newspaper ran. It's only a comparative statement. And so, when journalists are told you should not miss a story, what do they mean? What they are told is, all of you should carry the same stories. Otherwise, one of you will be missing a story, right? The occasional scoop is different. When you get a scoop, you don't tell anybody about it and you break it. But otherwise, this is what is happening. So there is a consensual process of narrowing the journalistic agenda, of narrowing the mental horizons. Instead of widening your mental horizons, your understanding of the world, in order to ensure that all the competing channels will carry the same news, you have these 4 items. And all of you will have these 4 items. All of you will discuss these 4 items. All of you will have the same experts discussing these 4 items. Only the anchor will be different. All of you will have more of the same sounding signature music before the news comes on. Why should you have 7 channels? You might just have 1 channel. What's the point in having more and more and more of the same? There's a law in economics called the law of diminishing returns. If you apply that law, you get more and more and more of the same, you reach a point where more becomes less. That is exactly what is happening now. It almost sounds funny, but you look at the English channels, I'm not even exaggerating this, you look at the 4 major English channels, you will find the same news, the same headlines, the same order. In fact, if you switch channels, you can move from one headline to the next, to the next, to the next, in the same order. And they'll give you the same amount of, same information. There's hardly any difference, just some cosmetic. In one channel, Arnab is speaking, another Rajdeep Savdasa is speaking, 3rd channel, Barkha Dutt is speaking. Otherwise, it's the same thing. They're all talking about surgical strike, or they're all talking about this aspect of, how to celebrate nationalism, or about this aspect of why there is some conspiracy theory here. And how is it, who plants these ideas in their minds? So it's become a very, very insidious operation, and we need to break free from this and get into a journalism which really makes a difference in the lives of our people. We also need to break from, the ethics of journalism would demand that in a country like India, we don't get fixated on event journalism alone, of dramatic events. So much so that you're saying breaking news for everything. If it's not breaking news, it's not news. Weather, Met Office forecast rain tomorrow, breaking news. What? I mean, rains when it's rainy season, it rains. Met Office says, traffic will be congested, or traffic office says that there's congestion on that road, breaking news. I mean, they've trivialized breaking news into news which refuses to break anymore. So, in every which way you're trivializing news, and this becomes a huge problem for the credibility of the news. So I think what I'm surprised is at the apathy of the people, the indifference of the people. As I said before, if journalism and if newspapers are a product of the market, you should at least exercise your consumers' rights. It would be a dramatic difference to any media organization if just 100 people went in front of a newspaper office or a television organization and silently stood there with banners saying, "We don't believe what you're saying." For 4 days, you can see the panic that will spread through that organization. Because the asset, unlike what these media organizations believe, the true capital of journalism is the trust, the credibility of the organization, of your news, of what you say. And if you find that people are skeptical about that, and if that becomes viral, and today with social media this kind of thing goes viral before you can say jack, it will affect the organization. I'm not therefore suggesting we should start doing that, but I'm saying we should start thinking about whether we are getting the news that we should be getting. Look at the fact that today fact-checking has become an important part of news. Why is that? It's historically unprecedented. When Trump speaks and then Hillary Clinton speaks, immediately afterwards CNN will say, now our fact-checkers are at work to find out how much of what they said was truth and how much of what they said was lie. And invariably 50% is lie. Because it's become a habit with politicians when they're on media to lie through their teeth because they think nobody's going to check this. Who is going to bother to find out? So fact-checking has become a necessary part of journalism. And that shows what a terrible plight journalism is. If everything that you say has to be fact-checked, then there's a problem, with the whole process of journalism. So I think it's important for the people of this country, of people who believe in democracy, people who think that journalism matters, I certainly do, to put pressure on journalism to change itself. It's not that we don't have competent journalists. I think almost all our channels have excellent journalists. There are people who can deliver. But when they are caught in this rat race, where missing the news becomes a problem. I was going to tell you that. So when you can't miss the news and you have to do the same news, they're all running the same, chasing the same news, and they're discussing the same stories. There should be an emphasis away from that, from event journalism to process journalism. These events are important, but not as important as the processes in a democracy. The processes of hunger, of disease, of malnutrition, all that affects people in our country. We don't talk about it because it's boring. It's not dramatic. It doesn't have a Sarita factor. You need that. You need some kind of something which makes it sit up. So this is unfortunately the plight of journalism. So every which way you look at it, ethics is the big casualty in the journalistic profession today. And what we need, therefore, is, because editors are no longer important, because editors have become irrelevant across the country. You see, what the owners, some of the very important owners who are using journalism just to make money, decided is, okay, you want your independence, okay, you be the editor and the CEO. This is what they did in paper after paper. You'll find that became the trend. The editor also becomes the CEO. In other words, he's responsible both for the news as well as for the revenue. And therefore, he's a self-contradiction already, you see. He has to look after the business, he has to decide what news will fetch in the business, and when advertising tells him, don't put up this news because this news is a danger. As we were discussing today, the biggest casualty in journalism today is what is not said, what is silenced, what doesn't even reach beyond the news, first reporters copy in the news desk. Because what is not said becomes even more of a dangerous, is even more important than what is said. Because what is not said is inconvenient, has been inconvenient to somebody, therefore it's not said. And therefore I think it's important that there's pressure on publishers, owners, And publishers' owners are a very wily lot, unfortunately. I'll just relate two incidents and stop. Some years back, there was a group called the Indian Media Group. Indian Media Group. This was a collection, or shall we say, a gathering, a club of major publishers, proprietors in India, of the big newspapers. I won't take names, because it had most respectable newspapers and the editors. Editors were also proprietors. You know, most newspapers now, the proprietor is the editor, or the proprietor's nominee or family member is the editor. They got together and wrote to the government that we should have what's called the Indian Media Group. In other words, their argument was that just as in businesses, legacy makes a big difference. The son of a big businessman takes over the business and expands it and so on. We are people who have dynastically run newspapers for several decades now. Therefore, we should be entrusted with looking after the newspaper dispensation in this country. That's the way to counter foreign influence on our newspapers. This was in the context of, FDI entry into the news area, foreign direct investment in the news area. They said the way to protect ourselves from foreign interference is by allowing these family newspaper organizations or news organizations to be in full charge and give them all the area to cover. So they were actually suggesting that we create a huge monopoly here because we don't want somebody else to come. And when there's a wage board, for instance, which talks about proper emoluments to journalists, the big newspapers go to the court and say, if you implement the wage board and we pay, and these are newspapers which have posted huge profits. If we pay these journalists a kind of wage board recommendations, we will be running out of our business. Therefore, it will be contravening the fundamental rights chapter of our constitution, which talks about freedom of expression. So when it suits them, they will pick the constitutional provision as to arm themselves against implementing the wage board, the Bachawat wage board recommendations. So these are all examples in which ethics is very, very compromised in the journalistic field. And I think since we are all products of the media, whether we like it or not, day in and day out, we are exposed to the media. If you're not exposed to the formal media, you're exposed to the media every time you use your mobile phone and receive those Twitter feeds from very important people. So willy-nilly, we are all subject to the media. It becomes our responsibility to change the media that we are part of, that we are victims of. Because as Tarsi Vitachi, a famous Sri Lankan journalist from this part of the world, said, information without transformation is sheer gossip. Information without transformation is sheer gossip. I put it to you to decide how much of what you're getting today is information, how much of what you're getting today is gossip. Thank you very much.